So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Pallav Rajan representing PMS Bazaar, and I welcome you all for another insightful webinar on the topic, India, a billion opportunities now. So to lead this presentation, we have none other than Marcellus investment team. We have Mr. Saurabh Mukherjee, who is the CIO, and we have Rakshit Ranjan, who is the portfolio manager, and we have Mr. Pramod Gudbi, who is the head of sales, also actively participate in investment committee of Marcellus Investment Manager. First of all, my heartiest congratulations to Marcellus team. They've successfully completed 3 years. It is pleasant memory to go back 3 years. In the month of October 2018, in our first edition of Summit PMS and AF Summit 2018, Saurabh formally announced, in fact, officially announced his launch of Marcellus PMS. And fast forward, looking today, they had a stupendous growth. And as we speak, they're managing about more than 8,500 clients with assets of about 12,000 crore, including FPI. So congratulations again. And with that note, would like to hand over the forum to Marcellus Investment team. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'll kick off. So we'll break the discussion into three parts, right? Since Pallav and PMS Bazaar have been kind enough to invite us to talk about the 3 years of Marcellus, we'll break the discussion into three parts. Firstly, how did we build the firm? How did we decide that there is a firm to be built? We were all working in a different firm where I was the CEO, Pramod was the head of equities, Rakshit was a fund manager there. So why did we quit our jobs and set up Marcellus? So we'll discuss what led us, what prompted us to set up the company. Rakshit will then discuss how we have thought through the product, rolled out the product, delivered 27% CAGR. 27% CAGR in the three years and 10 days that we've been live with consistent compounders. And Pramod will then tell you that how did we raise more AUM than anybody has done in the history of this country in their first 3 years, right? So each part of the story is each part of the Marcellus story is a bit of a chapter. So I'll kick off with the first chapter, then I'll hand over to Rakshit. So Pramod, Rakshit and I have been working together now for 18 years. But I think, truth be told, it wasn't until 4 years ago that we realized how colossal an opportunity India is. Now, one of the reasons for that is, and this is an important point, folks, most people in our country, they sort of buy the very conventional narrative of India. They tend to read the daily newspaper. They have they sort of on the same social media circuits as everybody else. And the common narrative of India, this is a poor country, ज़्यादा कुछ होने नहीं वाला. You should think of migrating promptly from the country, get your kids educated abroad. That's the kind of conventional narrative of India. It wasn't until 5 years ago that from our travels, sir, the Christmas celebrations happening in the background, if I try to stop it, 90 other people will shout me down. So those who are disturbed, I'm sorry about it, but people have come back to the office and I'm not going to stop them from celebrating. So 4 years ago, we started realizing how different the actual story of India is from the conventional narrative that is spun out for the country. And one of the reasons we were able to latch on to the story of India much quicker than the typical Indian fund managers, we travel a lot. Every quarter, we'll spend a couple of days in a small town, as far away from Bombay as possible. So for example, last weekend, part of the team was in Kanpur and Lucknow. 2 weeks hence, and another team heads off to UP. So these travels taught us a very important lesson. I'll give you the story of one trip 4 years ago, which was central to us understanding how powerfully the country has changed. There's a town called Boisar, around 105 kilometers from Bombay. It's on the Gujarat border. So from where I'm sitting, it's a 2.5-hour drive. So we've been visiting Boisar because it's not that far away. It's a 2.5-hour drive. We've been visiting Boisar every 2-3 years for the last decade or so. The trip 4 years ago was very interesting. And in a way, the trip exemplified why there was a colossal opportunity for people like us. So Boisar, just for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a very small town. Population will be no more than 2 lakh people. It's a extreme edge of a commuter town. It's on the almost on the Maharashtra-Gujarat border. So for those who are traveling from Boisar to Mumbai, it's almost a 2.5 hour commute on the train. And therefore, whilst there are some commuters who come to Bombay to earn their living, by and large, it's a self-contained mini industrial town. There are some factories there. The local farming community comes to Boisar for their weekly shopping, for buying their fertilizers, their implements, and for buying their clothes and so on. So it's like a microcosm of India. 4 years ago, December 2017, when we visited Boisar, we realized there were 3 startling things happening. Firstly, when we went to the local Kotak Bank branch, the HDFC Bank branch, the ICICI Bank branch, we realized from talking to the branch managers that CASA, right, financial liabilities were rolling into the bank branch, right? Second thing we learned from the bank managers is that people in Boisar, this is a small town, it's not some huge wealth conglomeration. We realized from talking to the bank manager that people in Boisar are increasingly saving in the stock market, either directly through demat accounts or through mutual funds. It's too small a town for people to do PMS, right? But the financialization of wealth is on full flight, 105 kilometers from Bombay. And third thing we realized is the real estate market in Boisar is not very active. Normally, what happens is, whether it's Chennai, Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, as you go out of the city in the hinterlands, you tend to get fairly vibrant real estate markets. 2017, the Boisar real estate market was dead as a dodo. We visited some of the factories. We visited some of the real estate developments. There genuinely was nothing happening, right? So you had a situation where there was a small town. The whole complexion of the financial ecosystem was changing. The complexion of the financial ecosystem was changing. Liabilities were rolling in. Financial services products, mutual fund products, stock market linked products were doing well. Real estate was down in the dumps. And then as we met the FMCG dealers, the Dabur distributor, the Marico distributor, the HUL distributor, we learned about the second layer of change, right? What they told us was that the DMart had come to Boisar. There was a DMart in Boisar which was thriving. It was taking away business from the traditional Kirana store. Secondly, and I stress this is December 2017. Secondly, Amazon was taking away business from the traditional distributor, from the traditional Kirana store. And I still remember to this day, and I met that man again a couple of months ago. The local HUL distributor, who also was, I think, the Dabur distributor, told me that, boss, I don't want my kids to be an FMCG distributor. By the time my kids grow up, the modern retail and Amazon, Flipkart will conventionally disrupt our world, the traditional FMCG world, right? And the third aspect of that trip was just the sheer vibrancy of the high street. December 17, the country wasn't as if GDP growth was 7-8%. GDP was all right, 6% growth, I think, at that time. But the high street was booming. Getting a shop in Boisar High Street was a tough ask. There were no vacancies. There was no empty shops on the high street, whether it was clothes, whether it was motorbikes. I remember visiting the Enfield dealership, the Hero dealership, the Maruti dealership. It was a thriving small town environment, right? And that's when we realized that the traditional narrative of India, that this is a country of finite opportunities, is false. The traditional narrative of India is actually, the reality is 180-degree opposite. This country is now a country of 1 billion opportunities. For the generation gone by, in a way, our parents' generation, unfortunately, it was a country of few opportunities. For us, the narrative is completely different. And whether it's Boisar, whether it is Coimbatore, whether it is Ludhiana, whether it is Sholapur, right? When you go to these sorts of towns, you realize that opportunity in India is threefold. The country is getting joined up. The highway network has doubled. The drive to Boisar from my office is 2.5 hours. The same drive a decade back was 3.5 hours. The highway networks have doubled in the country. Broadband users are up 50-fold. Airline traffic is up 5-fold in a decade. Bank accounts have trebled. Add to that GST, add to that UPI, add to that low cost mobile connectivity. You've joined the country together. When you join the country together, right? People in the hinterland, people in towns 2.5 hours away from Bombay start financializing their savings. They start entering the mainstream financial system. Why is that huge for us? Because 95% of India's wealth, right? I suspect for the vast majority of you on this call, the vast majority of your wealth is in flats, is in land, it's in gold. The RBI says 95% of the country's wealth is in physical assets. The financialization of that we could see is happening from our trips to small town India. And that meant to us that there are two big advantages. One is obviously if we start tapping into the financialization opportunity, there's natural wealth to be created for our clients and for us. But there's an even deeper point. When small town India starts saving through bank accounts ka CASA, starts saving through the stock market, starts saving through mutual funds, it brings down the cost of capital. And when you bring down the cost of capital, you help well-organized, well-run companies relative to the small town player, relative to the small-time player, right? So first aspect, you're joining up the country, you're financializing savings, you're bringing down the cost of capital. As you bring down the cost of capital, the advantages of being a large, well-run company become much higher, right? So in 2005, the 10-year bond yield was 16%. Today it is 6%, massive drop in the cost of capital. A Titan will benefit much more than a small town jeweler, right? A Bajaj Finance will benefit much more than a local money lender. The second aspect we realized in Boisar was the rise of this connected economy also means the death of informal businesses. So if you're the Kirana store, you'll hang around in a modest avatar, but by and large, the small town Kirana store, the small town local manufacturer will get disintermediated. Whether Amazon does it, whether JioMart does it, whether DMart does it is a matter of detail. But the relentless networking of the country, the rise of low-cost mobile connectivity, the rise of GST, and then therefore the rise of national supply chains means the death knell for millions of small businesses. The reverse of that, the death knell for millions of small businesses, means the rise of giant businesses who consolidate entire industries, whether it is supermarket retailing, a DMart, jewelry retailing, a Titan, footwear, a Relaxo, undergarments, a Page. And in front of us, when we make these trips to small town India, we could see the consolidation play out. This was even more exciting because on the one hand, the consolidation of the country means people like you on this conference call, on this Zoom call, people like you, people like our relatives across the nation, they will come into the stock market. On the other hand, the same consolidation, the same formalization means there'll be more opportunities for people like us to compound for you in the stock market, because the informal sector will be completely eviscerated by this consolidation dynamic. And the last part of this change, which we saw on that trip, in a way, the Royal Enfield dealership was the best place to see it, was the rise of mobile technology. Rise of mobile technology and what it does for dealers. So this is around the time that Royal Enfield had started allowing customization of their bikes, right? It's still ongoing. By the way, Royal Enfield is not in Eicher Motors is not in the consistent compounder portfolio, but I'm using this example to illustrate to you how powerfully technology has changed the business paradigm. So back in that Boisar visit 4 years ago, the dealer showed us how these small town people could customize their bike on their app, either sitting in the comfort of their house or in the Enfield dealership, right? So you ended up in a place where you went there with a preconception that ye to chota shehar hai, small town, and when you were leaving, you were realizing that what does Boisar lack that my suburban Bombay has? They have the same DMart that I have in my suburb. We met the DMart manager. He said the typical shopping basket is 85% similar to what people buy in DMart near my house in Bombay. The Hero Motor dealership and the Eicher Motor dealership were doing thriving business. The HDFC Bank and Kotak Bank CASA savings accounts were growing faster than they do in my suburb of Bombay. And you could very visibly see the integration of India. So that's when we started realizing that what are we doing, buying into the age-old narrative that India is not a land of opportunity, that straightforward things karo India mein, sara zindagi job karo, mutual fund mein invest karo, tax-free government bonds mein invest karo, buying flats. So that's the old narrative: buying flats, buying gold, tax-free bonds. That's the old narrative. The new narrative is this is a thriving economy in the throes of massive change, right? Change so epic that most of us living in this country don't realize that we are joining up the country, we are formalizing the country, and the rise of low-cost, world-class technology is fundamentally changing the way high-quality businesses, whether it's an Eicher Motors or indeed a Marcellus or indeed a PMS Bazaar, operate. That was the genesis of the creation of the firm. As many of you know, we chose the name Marcellus because we're big fans of Muhammad Ali. He's a sort of genuine example of a man who had the strength of his convictions to take a stance, which resulted in him being banned from boxing because he refused to go to Vietnam and kill people there. The ban was illegal. He went to the Supreme Court, successfully appealed. 5 years later, the US Supreme Court overturned the ban. And then Ali successfully regained the world title. And through the 70s went on to become the greatest fighter the world has seen. So Muhammad Ali's Christian name is Cassius Marcellus Clay. So we said, as we build Marcellus, we'll need the support of friends like PMS Bazaar. We will need clients like you, because we will go through ups and downs, as will the economy. And you need to be a little warrior when you go through ups and downs. Marcellus actually means little warrior. It is also our idol Muhammad Ali's middle name. So that's the creation of Marcellus. After we created the shop, Rakshit put the product on the table. So I'll request him to take us through the creation of the product. Thanks.
So thanks, Saurabh. Good afternoon, everyone. So on the backdrop of the macro opportunity that Saurabh highlighted, the portfolio construction at Marcellus is a combination of a couple of filters, which end up sort of eliminating companies on which we should not be spending our time, so that we can focus our efforts only on a short list of stocks in our coverage universe, and then go very, very deep in that, which then becomes the part of bottom-up research after the filters have sort of thrown away companies that we should not be looking at for a variety of reasons. So what are those filters, and what is the bottom-up research all about? The first filter, some of you might be aware, we are quite paranoid about accounting quality. So according to us, large majority of the Indian stock market, regardless of whether it is a large cap or a mid cap or a small cap segment of the market, large majority is composed of accounting frauds of a degree that you don't want to be associated with as an investor. There are both types. On the one hand, you'll have a poor quality, a hollow underlying business, but overstated accounts, and it's also the reverse, which is a great quality underlying business, but understated accounts because the promoter doesn't want to share the outcome of greatness of the underlying business with minority shareholders. So on either side, whether it is a great quality company with understated accounts or a hollow company with overstated accounts, these companies, since they are the majority, if they are part of your portfolio is exposed to massive drawdowns, unexpected drawdowns. And once you undergo a massive drawdown in your portfolio because of an accounting fraud, it's very difficult to actually recover from it and make money in the long run in a healthy way. So this step, in a way, is one of the risk mitigating filters, where we don't want to sort of sit on a landmine and expose ourselves to a massive drawdown. What comes out of our forensic proprietary fraud detection framework is no more than, say, 90 or 100 stocks out of, say, BSE 500, right? That's it. The remaining 400 to 410 companies in BSE 500, they don't meet the accounting criteria that our team has put together. In order to maintain and polish up our proprietary framework, we've got a team of 12 chartered accountants in Marcellus. They're really, really sharp at reading and tearing apart an annual report to pick up any red flags in the reported accounts. A snapshot of the kind of red flags that we pick up is in the table on the top right of this slide. These are quantifiable parameters, so it's not all subjective, it's not all qualitative, it's all quantitative, largely ways of picking up irregularity in accounts. What comes out of this filter is then put through the next filter, where once the accounts are clean, we also want the historical capital allocation track record to be very prudent and disciplined. Why do we want this? For a simple reason, that if you really want to make money in the long run from a stock, basis a healthy rate of fundamental compounding of the company, then you need two things. One, you need high pricing power and hence high return on capital employed, because obviously if a company doesn't have a great competitive advantage, high pricing power, then its return on capital employed cannot be high and cannot be sustained at a high level consistently. Secondly, you also need that company to plow back large part of the operating cash flow generated from a high pricing power into areas which deliver growth, whilst not undermining the ability to deliver high returns on capital in future. So you need a business that generates high degrees of cash flows at any point of time, thanks to high pricing power. And then you also need that business to reinvest that cash into areas which also deliver high returns on capital employed. That's the only mantra, that's the only way in which any company, regardless of which sector it is in, which country it is in, this is the only way in which over the longer run, a company can make money for itself, for its shareholders, right? Because this is the only way, what we seek in the historical capital allocation track record is consistency of returns on capital employed above a minimum threshold of around cost of capital, and consistency of revenue growth, which will only come if capital reinvestment happens consistently as well in prudent ways. Revenue growth should be at least say nominal GDP growth or higher. So those are the two filters. We put these two filters on long historical time periods, as in 10, 15 years or longer, and we seek consistency. We do not want to speculate on companies which don't have a history. We do not want to speculate on companies which had a very volatile history, but for some reason there is a promise of consistency in future. We want the companies to have already delivered the kind of fundamental compounding that we expect from them in future, and then we want to learn from history. History is a very good raw material in our research process. One of the biggest raw materials, I would say. We want to learn from history to understand the DNA of these companies, and then figure out whether we can be convinced about their ability to sustain the pricing power at high levels in the long-term future. So that's the second step. Once you put this filter to test, out of the sort of 90 or 100 clean account companies, no more than a couple of dozen, no more than 24, 25 companies, they clear the second filter. What comes out of these two filters is then put through our bottom-up research process, where our entire research team of around 16 odd analysts today, our entire research team puts its head together and figures out the sort of competence of that business on two broad aspects. The left half of the slide, which is talking about the here and now, we want the here and now to be representative of a very high degree of competitive advantage, very high degree of moat. The ability to stand against competition, no matter how fierce the competition is, without compromising on the rate of your cash generation. For instance, if a Patanjali is offering half price products against an FMCG player, then we will consider the FMCG player great only if the FMCG player doesn't have to compromise on either profitability by cutting down its product prices and matching with Patanjali's lower prices, or by compromising on market share because Patanjali was successful in taking some part of the customer base away, right? If neither profitability nor market share can get compromised, even in the face of very intense competition, then it is reflective of high pricing power. We want to understand the reasons why such high pricing power exists for some of the companies in our coverage universe, and to what degree do we see competition not being a risk in the rate of free cash flow compounding for these companies in future. So that's one part where our research team does the bottom-up understanding. The second part where they do this research is around sustainability of greatness. Not so much the existence of greatness, which is the left half of the slide. It's the sustainability of the greatness, which is the right half of the slide. This is actually even more important than purely existence of greatness, right? Why is it even more important? Simply put, for any high quality business, the biggest area of undervaluation in the share price of a company is the longevity. It is not so much the ability of investors to understand that the company is good in the here and now. The bigger area of undervaluation happens typically around the degree to which greatness can be sustained into the long-term future. Very often for high quality companies, longevity is underappreciated in the share prices, and that ends up becoming the biggest source of performance for our portfolios, which is a better understanding of longevity of businesses compared to what the market is currently factoring in. Now, longevity gets defined in two ways. One is the tangible aspect, which is the capital allocation. If capital allocation happens in areas that provide reinvestment of capital with high returns on capital, that's one piece. So in the lethargy score vertical on the slide, you can see there are three aspects around which we want to stay convinced about sustainability of greatness. One is capital allocation should be to deepen the existing moats. So if a Dr. Lal PathLabs' moat today is faster turnaround times compared to a Metropolis, if an Asian Paints' moat today is better supply chain compared to its competition, we want to know why we should believe that 5 years down the line, Dr. Lal PathLabs' turnaround times will be even faster than they are today. Asian Paints' supply chain greatness will be even stronger than what it is today, right? We want to see tangible evidence of capital being invested in such areas, right? So that's the deepening of the here and now, the deepening of the existing piece over the, say, next 3 to 5 years. The second piece of capital allocation, which we seek is the addition of new revenue growth drivers, right? Once every 3-5 years, we want to see our portfolio companies adding new drivers of revenue to their overall products and services. Because if you stick to just one product, one category, one geography throughout your life as a company, eventually you are exposing yourself to risk of saturation, risk of fatigue. You're also exposing yourself to risk of maybe competitors trying to replicate your business, and hence we want the companies to evolve beyond their existing core and add new revenue growth drivers. So an Asian Paints doing waterproofing, a Dr. Lal PathLabs trying out genetics, or doing, let's say, home sample collection. A Page Industries moving from men's innerwear to women's innerwear, and then to kids innerwear and outerwear, leisure wear. All of these are areas which we want to see tangibly convince ourselves about the sustainability of free cash generation in future. The third aspect of capital allocation we want to get convinced about is radical disruption of the whole business, of the whole industry, once in a decade or once every 2 decades, right? If you don't see that, then you'll have the case of, let's say, a PVR waiting for a Netflix to come and change the consumer habits. If had PVR been a lot more proactive, maybe the market share loss to a Netflix wouldn't have been as great. We don't want a blockchain to disrupt an Asian Paints. We actually want an Asian Paints to use blockchain to change the rules of the game of the industry. We don't want fintech to sort of disrupt Bajaj Finance. We want Bajaj Finance to do fintech and disrupt the lending industry, so on and so forth, right? So these are areas of radical disruption we want to see in our portfolio companies. And then comes the extreme rightmost vertical, which provides longevity to greatness. That's around softer aspects of a business. We want to see the board of directors being independent and high quality, senior management team composed of professionals who are identified several years in advance as possible successors, and then groomed into those roles till the day they really do become successors. Process-oriented approach towards senior management candidature, and systems and processes to execute the business at the ground level. There are two main reasons why we want the softer aspects to be very, very strong in our portfolio companies. One, it provides continuity to the business, so that a CEO resigning, retiring, maybe meeting with an unfortunate outcome, it shouldn't lead to a massive disruption to the sustainability of greatness for this business. So one is continuity. The second is scalability. If the business is dependent on one promoter member or one CEO or one product or one decision of the board, so on and so forth, you won't be able to scale up beyond a point. And hence we want the management bandwidth, the board level strategic decision making to also be reflective of scalability, right? So that's the research framework. All our research analysts, they score our portfolio companies on the granular components of each of these verticals. Those scores are then interplayed to reflect the true risk reward that the philosophy of the product is intending to deliver. And that interplay then defines the whole portfolio construction in terms of the number of companies we will end up holding in the portfolio and which stock gets how much allocation in the portfolio. I see somebody asked earlier on in either the chat or Q&A, what is our position sizing framework? This is our position sizing framework. We want to quantify even the qualitative aspects. We want to quantify and compare the board of directors of an Asian Paints and an HDFC Bank, right? And those quantification, those metrics are behind the interplay which delivers the position sizing of our portfolios, right? So that's a research framework. Now let's quickly talk about quantifiable outcomes of this for our clients, for our portfolios. If you look at the free cash flow is the only driver of value in the longer run, right? Valuation of any business at any point of time is the present value of all expected future free cash flows, right? If you look at the free cash flows of our portfolio companies over the last 20 years, they've been compounding at around mid-20s, right? Which means a mid-20s compounding for 20 years means they've become 100 times bigger in free cash flow generation today than they were two decades ago. That obviously might lead to some apprehension or some questions, some concerns that, look, these companies have already become so big, quite possibly they delivered a great last 20 years of fundamental compounding because of the rate at which they compounded when they were small, which is actually not the case. If you really break the 20-year time period down into, say, 5 years or 10 years, right? Every 5 or 10-year time period has been equally healthy and consistent, right? It's not that the first 10-year time period was faster growth than the last 10-year time period. Despite the fact that, mind you, especially the last 5 or 6 years have been utterly disruptive for our portfolio companies, right? The external environment, whether it be GDP growth, whether it be the broader market's earnings growth, right? It has been adversely affected by events such as GST introduction, demonetization, COVID crisis, the financial crisis that happened during 2018-19, so on and so forth. But our portfolio, which is exposed from its sectoral exposure, it is exposed to these events. It didn't undergo any moderation in free cash flow compounding. So that degree of consistency of healthy free cash flow compounding is what these companies have delivered in the past, and this is exactly what we expect them to deliver in future when we hold them in our portfolio. Quite reassuringly, when you compare the table on the right with table on the left, the table on the right, which is the share price, is a 1:1 correlation with table on the left. Share prices of our portfolio companies move in tandem with the free cash flow compounding, and that in effect is suggestive of fundamentals fully backing the performance, and there is no vacuum being created where fundamentals lag behind performance of our portfolio companies. Not at all. Here the fundamentals are fully supporting performance. If you just go one level deeper into how to look at these fundamentals, typically what you would see is our portfolio companies will compound their revenues at around say 15, 17, 18% CAGR, mid-teen, they will then undergo a little bit of an operating margin expansion to deliver earnings growth of around say 18, 20%. So the last three columns, you can see earnings growth in the longer run has been mid to high teens for our portfolio companies. But then there's a lot of action, there's a lot of activity happening between earnings, profit after tax, and free cash flows, right? Around working capital compression consistently in a very, very sustainable way, year after year after year, in terms of asset turn increases, sweating the assets harder, productivity improvements consistently year after year after year, right? And these two elements, working capital compression and asset turn expansion, on top of market share gains, revenue growth, and operating efficiency on the P&L, are a combination of factors which end up delivering the free cash flow compounding of mid-20s for our portfolio companies. Interestingly, we've seen a repeat of that happen even in the last couple of years, right? Despite the fact that we've gone through a massive disruption through the COVID period, if you look at a 2-year CAGR of revenues, we are back to the mid to high teens for almost all of our portfolio companies, right? I'm talking about 2-year CAGRs here because I don't want to take up 1-year growth. I don't want to take up the Q2 YOY, for instance, because somebody can easily argue that, look, a year ago, the base effect was so small. I mean, the base was so small that the base effect is very favorable on a 1-year comparison. That's why we've taken 2 years, so that pre-COVID to today is what we compare. And these revenue growth numbers are reflective of the kind of benefits that a disruption like a COVID and the resilience that our portfolio companies have delivered. Revenue growth is back to mid to high teens, and hence free cash flow growth is also back to the 20s. In summary, looking forward, there are actually 4 benefits that we see our portfolio companies reaping from the recent events. The recent events in particular being, let's say, the COVID crisis, the whole raw material availability crisis, the input cost inflation, so on and so forth. All of these factors which have sort of challenged the status quo of many industries, right? They have 4 beneficial effects for our portfolio companies. One is the acceleration of market share gain. What Saurabh talked about in his initial slide of unorganized segment giving way to organized in terms of market share of polarization happening in India. An event like COVID has accelerated that, right? And the acceleration of this market share shift from unorganized to organized, from weaker organized to stronger organized, isn't yet complete. It will continue for at least 2-3 years as a wake effect of COVID before we go back to the more normal rate of market share gains for our portfolio companies. So that's one piece where competition gets crippled, whether it be organized competition. More recent quarters, a Dr. Lal PathLabs has grown far faster than a Metropolis or a Thyrocare, etc. An Asian Paints has grown far faster than a Nerolac or an Akzo Nobel, etc. Or whether it be unorganized competition, where many small businesses who are unorganized, they've actually shut shop. Right, so that's one piece which is yet to fully play out when we are yet to reap the complete benefit of COVID here. The second piece is many capital allocation decisions have been taken by our portfolio companies. So Pidilite acquiring Araldite, a Dr. Lal acquiring Suburban Diagnostics, a Page Industries investing heavily in technology. Many of our, so Dr. Lal doing home sample collection, expanding into West and South India, so on and so forth. A Titan making wedding jewelry a big success given the kind of opportunity that had been left unaddressed by Titan till 3-4 years ago in wedding. There are many capital allocation initiatives that have been implemented in the last couple of years by means of acquisitions or organic growth, which otherwise might have taken a lot longer for these companies to implement, and hence COVID has accelerated this piece of fundamental compounding. The third piece is tech investments, right? Many parts of the ecosystems of our portfolio companies have started adopting technology far more easily, far more effectively than they used to prior to COVID. They were forced to adopt technology because systems and processes were the only way to overcome logistical challenges that COVID threw up, right? And hence, once from the customer to the raw material provider, everyone in your value chain, if everyone in your value chain is more accommodative towards technology, then tech investments become a massive source for value creation, right? And this is where an Asian Paints doing labor-oriented services through home decor, accelerating that initiative. Someone like a Page Industries automating its replenishment of inventory with the distributors, automating some of the manufacturing plants, providing, let's say, Titan taking up CaratLane to do e-commerce and omni-channel types of sales for some of their customers, so on and so forth. Many such initiatives. The Bajaj Finance becoming a pure fintech by offering not just lending services, but much beyond lending over the last couple of years in a very, very strong cross-selling and hence profitable manner to its existing customer base. These are some of the areas where tech investments have become a big addition to the growth prospects of our portfolio companies for the next 3 to 5 years. And then comes the more recent one, the raw material inflation, the unavailability of raw material. This becomes a very good opportunity. This sort of a scenario, whenever it happens, where raw material prices go up in a meaningful manner, it becomes an opportunity for a high quality company to say that, look, I can derive operating efficiencies which my competitors cannot. As a result, I can live with lower degrees of price increases, which will suffocate my competition, because the competition will have to compromise on either margins or market share when I don't hike product prices enough because of my operating efficiencies being superior to my competition, right? Many companies in our portfolio have done this. Pidilite and Asian Paints are the best examples, where the raw material hikes have also been the highest, and hence we'll see benefits of this in the form of market share consolidation accelerating thanks to the dislocation in raw material availability and prices. So in summary, next 3 to 5 years, we expect the free cash flow compounding to be at least as healthy and consistent as we've seen these companies deliver in the past, and hence remain quite optimistic of fundamentals supporting healthy performance in future. So that's broadly it, and hence, as I summarized, longevity of free cash flows is the sustainability of free cash flows is the biggest part of undervaluation in our portfolio companies' case. I'm sure many of you will be trying to ask questions around valuation. So a very quick snapshot here, and then we can go into deeper details if needed. If you pick up 2 companies, let's say scenario 1 is one company where for the first 5 years, 25% rate of compounding of earnings or free cash flow happens, and then uncertainties creep in, because of which rate of growth tapers down, versus a second company, let's say scenario 3, where for the next 25 years, 25% rate of compounding continues and uncertainties are not creeping in over the next 5, 10, 15 years for a company. The difference in fair value of these 2 companies is going to be massive, right? The fair value PE, the last column that you can see, the difference in fair values of these companies is going to be massive, which is what we are trying to benefit from in consistent compounders, and which in a way is what we have managed to deliver as our performance of the portfolios, which I'll quickly project here. This is the performance. At this point, I'll just hand it over to Pramod to take you through a couple of slides.
So, folks, I know you're here to know about how Marcellus can make you money rather than knowing about how Marcellus makes money for itself. But, we thought we'll bring it up because the two are quite linked to each other. In fact, Pallav suggested that given it's our 3rd anniversary, and given the PMS Bazaar Forum is always an auspicious event for us, I guess they set the tone at the beginning itself. We launched the Marcellus CCP or Marcellus PMS license at PMS Bazaar's first event. So there's a very, very close and auspicious relationship here. So it's good to talk about our journey. I'll be brief. The intention is not to gloat about our success. Like I said, it's about trying to understand the journey from what can we take away from here, which can be used for our own success. So we manage about 12,000 crores today. But to be honest, none of us in our wildest imaginations had thought that we'll be managing 12,000 crores in 3 years' time. So it is way beyond any of our expectations, and we're very, very grateful to what's happened around us. And the reason is, like every success story, there are several fathers to it, and certainly one of the biggest fathers is always luck, or what we call as the right place, right time to it. So what was the right time, right place elements for us has bearings on how you can invest and make money for yourself, or you can invest in your own careers or businesses, because ultimately we're all operating in the same economy as our portfolio companies. The first element I think Saurabh talked about, I won't elaborate, which was the financialization of savings in the country, right? Indians are putting more and more money in financial assets, whether it's bank deposits, insurance policies, mutual funds, PMSs, AIFs, whatnot, compared to what they were doing hitherto. Hitherto, we had a very, very different level of love for real estate and gold. Somewhere in the last 10 years, various factors we can discuss in detail, that has changed, and turns out that we spotted that opportunity. Saurabh, way back in 2015, as a leading strategist in a sell-side house that we work for, called Ambit, wrote about the demise of real estate as a default investment class in this country, which eventually got accelerated by demonetization, GST, RERA, and so on, which plowed money into the financial system. Indeed, one of the biggest reasons for us to leave Ambit and set up Marcellus was this theme. We thought that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of financialization of savings. And even if we get a sliver of it, we should be able to do well for ourselves in terms of careers. But what was more interesting is what Saurabh and I saw while at Ambit was more theoretical construct, the sort of data points that RBI talked about in terms of its report, where barely 5% of India's household savings is in financial assets. What we saw when we set up Marcellus, when we visited these households, including one of the legendary roadshows Pallav and team organized for us back in, Pallav, was it December 2018 in Tamil Nadu?
Yeah.
We went to towns like Coimbatore, Tirupur, Salem, Erode. Some of my colleagues hadn't even heard of these towns, and it was fascinating to see that this 5% financial asset penetration was an understatement. In several cases, it was zero, perhaps 1 or 2%. Many of them had not invested in financial assets ever in their lives, right? And that was changing. Hitherto, if they saw anybody coming from Bombay, they would think that these are looters. They'll come and loot us and go. But at least they were open to potentially investing. So what we saw as a theoretical opportunity in terms of financialization of savings on paper, we now experienced it real time. And that's been, in my view, the biggest driver of our journey in 12,000 crores. Irrespective of what we've done, what we've not done, the opportunity is huge. The second right time, right place element was about the networking of the country that Saurabh talked about, right? So we could go to places like, Salem, Erode, Tirupur, and all the roads, they're beautiful. You can do a road trip, cover all 4 towns in a single year. And many of these towns are now directly connected by air, right? So hitherto, if you want to reach these towns, you had to go to a big city and then drive up many hours or take a train. Air travel has become, but the biggest driver of networking has been telecom and social media boom, right? Which played to our strengths in some ways. Because my colleagues have written books, and we've all had careers in the sell side where there's a lot of writing. So we write a lot of newsletters, and we did a lot of webinars even before COVID, right? And the intention of writing books, newsletters, and webinars was not to, grow our business. We thought it was our responsibility to be transparent to our clients who've given us their hard-earned savings, who trusted us with their hard-earned savings. The least we can do is tell them openly, frequently, transparently about what we're doing with their money. Now, it turned out, because of the telecom and social media boom, everybody, the newsletters go viral on social media. Everybody's on YouTube watching these snippets of webinars and so on, which played to an advantage, and hence, awareness about our funds, and everything grew and enabled us in terms of capitalizing on this opportunity of financialization. And the third element of luck or right place, right time was just a year into our journey, we found the corporate tax rates come through. I mean, there's more around the investment philosophy, why the investment philosophy had come of age in terms of how we can all make money in a very simple and very less volatile way. So the tax rate cuts gave us one fillip, which showed that profitable companies generally tend to benefit more from tax rate cuts. So that was one leg up, but the bigger benefit came through in terms of what we used to say as consistent compounders. What we used to say as volatility was in the crash of January, February, March 2020, when stocks and the markets were falling left, right, and center. In that year ending March 2020, the market was down 25%. And a consistent compounders portfolio was up 8%. It was a 33% outperformance. In some ways, that sort of gave the proof of concept. What we used to talk about, low volatility is the way of making money, actually came through in the form of significant outperformance during those difficult periods of the COVID crash, which effectively said that what consistent compounders says on the tin is exactly what you get. And that obviously accelerated our fund flows and led us to this. Now, the big takeaway from all of this is that the title of this webinar, which is India, it's a billion opportunities. The opportunity is huge beyond anything many of us can comprehend. We believe, having seen this with our own eyes, that 12,000 crores is something like barely scratching the surface. And the country is changing in many ways. This whole networking, telecom boom, which means that all those things that Saurabh talked about, formalization of the economy, technology enablement, will throw even more opportunities for those who are discerning. Having said that, the world is also becoming a more volatile place, a more unpredictable place. So you can't really base your decisions, not just investment decisions, whether you're in business, your business decisions or your career decisions, based on a certain scenario, because we're going to see significant volatility. A lot of things are going to be unpredictable. So it's best to be prepared. Best to be prepared if you're an investor with companies with strong balance sheets, strong competitive advantages, so that even in the face of adversity, you're left with a reasonably decent outcome. The same applies as a businessman. If you're not taking an untoward risk, if you're building competitive advantages, the same applies if you are a salaried professional. So the opportunity is huge. We reckon it's our game to lose. This is a parallel that we can draw from our journey towards our portfolio companies, which can be extended towards how Marcellus can help you make money rather than making money for ourselves. With that, I'll bring the attention back to what your area of interest. I'm sure there are lots of people asking lots of questions. We'll try and answer as many of them as Pallav permits. Over to you, Pallav.
Pramod, thank you. In fact, thanks to Saurabh and thanks to Rakshit as well. Initially I kept my introduction very short to ensure that we get as much as time from the Marcellus team. But it's been 55 minutes now. The actual schedule was 1 hour, so balance is about 5 minutes left. But still, what we can do, there are a plethora of questions, which is pouring around the forum, as well as I have a lot of questions which has been collated from our investors. So what I think that basically we can take some 5 questions, for next couple of minutes. And then, in fact, I was planning to request now I take the liberty to demand with Marcellus team that whatever questions is unanswered, I'll send you those questions. Would request to send back to us in a week's time so that I can send it to the respective investors who have raised this question. So this is a demand from our end. So moving on, what I'll do out of these 5 questions, 3 questions I'll take from what we have collected from the clients, and balance 2 questions I request Pramod to choose from the forum. So this is the format we'll have. And out of these 3 questions, 2 questions are very simple. I would like to put it to Saurabh. And why I'm taking this simple question is that, we've been addressing this client for almost 4 years now. And every day we get subscribers through PMS Bazaar website. These 2 questions has been, predominantly asked by majority of the clients, even though it's very simple. But we've been addressing these questions to the client who've been raising. But still, I thought to take a wisdom from Saurabh as well. Now, the first question is that there are a couple of products like mutual funds, PMS, AIF. why somebody needs to choose PMS? Or as a portfolio manager, what is the edge you get as a product of a PMS?
Right. So just to be clear, the way SEBI has constructed our financial services landscape, and I sit both on the relevant SEBI committees for mutual fund and for PMS. The mutual fund has been created for as a risk controlled investment vehicle for middle class people who don't have 50 lakhs or crore. These are the typical mutual fund investor will have a few lakhs at hand, and because it's intended for the mutual fund is intended for people of modest means. There is a book this thick of mutual fund regulations, which basically uses a variety of regulatory techniques to reduce risk associated with the mutual fund. The result is 90% of equity mutual funds fail to beat the benchmark. It's not the fund manager's fault at many levels. The whole construct of mutual fund regulations is such that you're unlikely to get compounding more than the market. The Indian market, as most of you I'm sure know, compounds at around 12-13%, right? The PMS doesn't have 90%. 90% of the restrictions which are binding on a mutual fund are not binding on a PMS. And therefore, portfolio managers like Rakshit can create high quality concentrated portfolios for you. We don't have to charge you fixed fees. We can charge you entirely profit share fees. In our case, we don't charge you fees all the way up to 8%. We get paid on returns in excess of 8%. The mutual fund can't do that. Mutual fund, it's not allowed to do profit share. It only operates on fixed fees. Because a mutual fund typically has 50-60 stocks, out of which 40 are dud stocks where there is no compounding. A mutual fund's returns get compressed 12-13%. Some of you are asking for track record. It's on the website. We publish it every month. It's on PMS Bazaar's data. We've compounded at 27% from inception 3 years ago. We've beaten the index by a country mile. We beat the index last month. We beaten the index this year. We beaten the index last year. They beaten the index year before that. And whilst I would love to say it's all because of our skill, we also have to realize that one of the reasons we are beating the index is the PMS construct gives us that flexibility to invest for you in 14-15 outstanding franchises, which are growing at 25%. And as a result, our clients' wealth is growing at 25%, whereas the market is growing 10 percentage points slower than that. So there's nothing wrong with the mutual fund. It's just that the mutual fund is not intended to outperform the market because of the variety of rules and regulations around it. A PMS is intended for high net worth individuals. So if you don't have 50 lakhs, then obviously the SEBI rules will not allow you to invest in a PMS. And 99% of people in our country will never have the 50 lakhs to become a Marcellus client, which is why we write the books, Pallav. One of the reasons we write the books is 99% of Indians will never have the money to become our clients. And for them, therefore, the book is our way of giving them all our knowledge away free of charge. Our website also gives away all of this knowledge away free of charge. If you have the 50 lakhs, come to us. We'll compound your money, and you can see the track record on the screen. The mutual fund won't be able to do this for the reasons I just mentioned.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thanks for that. So the next question again, there are clients has money 50 lakhs and also interested in certain products. Let's take even Marcellus for that matter. But of late, what we hear is that they fare on all-time high. It can be the indices or on the valuation side. And even, if market is correcting, even taking the recent corrections, they're looking for a better entry. It's always been, very difficult for a client to take a decision.
So again, the mental model is incorrect. The mental model is the old India. So my son's educational career is at an all-time high. He's in class 9. Last year also, my son was at an all-time high. He was in class 8. The year prior, he was at an all-time high, class 7, right? Similarly, Asian Paints' share price pretty much every year for the last 40 years touches an all-time high. Why? Because Asian Paints compounds at 25%. Rakshit, can we go to that slide which shows the 25% compounding? So whether it is Asian Paints or my son, whether it is my daughter or Pidilite, my daughter also is at an all-time high. She's in class 7. Last year, she was at an all-time high. It was class 6. Pidilite also is at an all-time high. They're compounding at 30%. So if you see Asian Paints, the free cash flow compounding 20 years, Asian Paints compounds at 24%. It did so the last 20 years, the last 10 years, the 10 years prior to that, the latest 5 years, the 5 years prior to that, the 5 years prior to that, which is why, and similarly with Pidilite, similarly with all these investee companies. So just like, if I tell my son that, can you take it a little easy because I need a correction in your educational career before I invest further in your educational career, right? I hope all of you understand how stupid this is, right? I don't think anybody goes home and tells their daughter or son, take it easy for a few months so that I can invest in your educational career once there's a bit of a correction. So fail the next exam so that when I reinvest in your class 11, 12, you've sort of failed for a year. Right? Nobody does that, right? Unless you're bonkers, you don't tell your kids, take a holiday for a year, fail your next exam. So we're not going to call up the boardrooms of these companies and say, can you stop compounding the business so that there's a correction in the share price so that we have a better entry point? Unless you're out of your mind, you won't do that. Now, barely 30 companies in India are of this quality. Right. And just as in my son's school, and I suspect for most of you, your kids are also similar to my kids, right? There won't be that many kids in their class as bright as your and my kids. There aren't very many companies in India of this caliber. Most companies will fail, right? So just like I went to school, the class I started with in KG, only half of them made it to class 10. The rest of them failed along the way and they dropped behind. Similarly with the stock market, right? Of the 500 stocks in the BSE 500, 85% will not be seen 10 years from now. That was the case for the last 10 years. Similarly, just as with children, similarly with stocks. So nobody tells their kids to have a correction so that then you can reinvest in their education. Don't look for corrections in companies. If you do, there's something fundamentally wrong in the mental model. So, and on the valuation issue, as Rakshit showed you, the left table is showing you 25% compounding in the business. The right table is showing you 25% compounding in the share price, right? And therefore there is no valuation challenge today, which is any better or worse than last year or the year prior. These companies are growing at 25%. The share prices are growing at 25%. For Christ's sakes, don't try to time the market. Chapter 6 of our latest blockbuster bestseller, Chapter 6 of Diamonds in the Dust, folks. Diamonds in the Dust is the latest Marcellus bestseller, right? You can buy it either at a bookshop near you or on Amazon, or you can buy the pirated copies on the footpaths of India, right? Chapter 6 of this book will tell you why trying to time the market is the most useless use of time for busy people like you. Get in there, invest in great companies. We're giving you the names away. The book gives you more names away. If you don't want to invest with us and you want to save yourself fees, for Christ's sakes, invest yourself in the stocks without going through us. But don't try to time the market. It is the biggest folly you could commit.
Yeah, well put, Saurabh. So I'll move to the next question. Again, broadly, a lot of clients are asking, since you've been very transparent in sharing your stock list as well, we often get this question. Recently listed tech business alike, being it Zomato's, Paytm, Policybazaar, Nikos of the world, are not part of your portfolio, right? So maybe because of your filters, obviously. But do these players prompt you to change the portfolio?
So out of those businesses you mentioned, Pallav, only one business actually makes any money. Right? Only one business makes any money. So, as all of you know, we are a poor country, right? We're a very poor country. So when I go home from work, at every traffic light, there are these poor beggars who come and ask for money. Right? And unfortunately, they're hungry. There is probably some underground mafia which organizes these begging expeditions. But we all feel sympathy for people who beg for money, right? Because they have no business model. They have no way to earn a living, right? Similarly, in business, in finance, the definition of a business model is how a company makes money. If a company doesn't make money, it's all right, but it's not a company then, it's a charity. It's dependent on the benevolence of others to survive. You see what I mean, Pallav? If a company doesn't make money, if PMS Bazaar, if Marcellus didn't make money, if we didn't turn a profit, you'd be dependent on the charity of others, typically the kindness of strangers. So in all good faith, we can't take your money or your and our clients' money, Pallav, and put it in companies which have never made money, which have no idea how they'll ever make money, right? Because that's no different than giving a charity money. We can give a charity money, but that's part of our CSR. That's part of our CSR effort. It's not part of the investment committee's responsibilities. So we look for companies which grow their cash flows at 25%. Out of the companies you mentioned, Pallav, one company just generates cash. They haven't grown the cash yet, but they at least generate cash. The rest of the companies fall in the definition of charities. Nothing wrong with charities, but they're part of the CSR effort, not part of the investment committee effort.
Fine, Saurabh. Pramod, were you able to choose questions or?
Yeah, so one question I saw fascinating was a different angle of this new age tech companies causing disruptions and so on. I thought it was a very well articulated question because that's the central theme of our investment philosophy, which is about barriers to entry. I'll just find that question. And so it's about giving examples of last decade saw companies like Jio, Zerodha, UPI, Zoom applications. The question is, do you think in the near future, government or any private company will disrupt Marcellus' way of investing? Because by nature, government or companies turn their head wherever money is getting made. Naturally, right? So, I mean, it is natural way of life. Extremely profitable companies will always face the highest competitive threat or intervention. Which is why we keep banging our head about entry barriers and sustainable competitive advantages. If you are making a lot of money with no entry barriers, naturally that you're prone to disruption. Which is why it's not so much important to focus on growth opportunity. Like Saurabh said, we're still a poor country. Growth is aplenty, but plenty of growth with no entry barrier will not make you any money. The case in point being our airline and telecom industries, because they tend to attract a lot of attention. But at the same time, profitable companies with entry barriers will attract attention. Plenty of companies have entered the paints industry, right? Including the world's largest paints company, Sherwin-Williams, and several. And they'll keep coming. They'll keep coming. Yet during this period of competitive entry, Asian Paints market share has only gone up. Why? Because it's built a moat or a competitive advantage around it. But it's a beautiful question. It's central to our investment philosophy. I'm glad whoever asked this question. And I'm hoping that everybody else on this call gets this point home. Do not focus on the flavor of the day because so-and-so think renewable energy is booming and I should invest in renewable energy or whatever your neighbor is saying. Always answer the question, irrespective of the boom, will this company in question be able to defend itself against such competition? On the government intervention, you're right. Of course, monopolies naturally tend to attract a lot of attention and government intervention historically. But there are two types of monopolies. One who abuse their monopolistic power at the expense of the consumer. If you are abusing your monopolistic power at the expense of the consumer, it is the right of the government or the regulator, whoever it is, to intervene and ensure that sort of exploitation doesn't happen. But there are sort of monopolies who extend the benefits of their monopolistic position to their customers. I think Rakshit mentioned time and again how an Asian Paints or Pidilite have grown their revenues with very little contribution from price hikes. They don't take price hikes. They don't use their dominant position to squeeze the customer. In return, the customer returns loyalty, and that makes it a more sustainable business model. As a byproduct, by not hiking prices as a monopolistic or a large player, you're also making it difficult for your not so large competitors to survive, and that makes it an even more stronger business. So whether it's government or competition, you need to figure out companies which can defend itself against competition and show to the regulator that you're actually helping the consumer reduce his cost of purchase.
Right. I would like to have one question for Rakshit. Basically what we found is that there have been a couple of exits from your side over the period. I'm talking about in the last 3 years, to name few, Group Finance, Marico, ITC, Relaxo. And I think there is also an addition, being it HDFC Life, Titan, TCS, which has been added recently, and About. So this exit, basically the construction of the portfolio, what is the value addition it has given, or it is too short to quantify that?
No. The value is obviously opportunity cost is always difficult to quantify. As in, what would have been the portfolio performance had we not done X, Y, Z? It is a little difficult to quantify. Although if you make it very simple, and had we not made those changes, had we not added a Titan, a TCS, well, TCS has been a very recent addition. It hasn't yet contributed massively to the 3-year CAGR. But had we not added a Titan and About a Bajaj Finance in replacement of a Group Finance, a Marico, Somebody can do a simple math that it would have certainly added maybe 3 to 5 percentage points to the annualized rate of compounding. Remember, it's not just a churn to the effect of complete exit or complete entry, which adds to this sort of 5% extra. It is also the rebalancing, which is part churn, right? So we in the middle of the COVID crash last year, in the month of April, we bought 6% extra in Bajaj Finance by shaving off 2%, 1 to 2% each from Pidilite, Abbott, Asian Paints, I think 1 or 2 other companies, Nestle. So we shaved off 1 to 2 percentage points from companies which had not fallen through the crash and bought bucket load of a particular company which had fallen massively, in this case, Bajaj Finance. And that added, because we bought Bajaj Finance extra 6% at the bottom, more or less, or not so much at the bottom, but after a 60% fall, and from there it has recovered, etc. The maths is clearly suggestive of a very healthy contribution to our overall rate of compounding through changes made to the portfolio allocations, either partial changes or complete changes, as in complete exit, complete entry. But more importantly, what this is also in a way reflective of is the requirement, the desire and the intent on our part to stay alive and awake to the evolving environment for our portfolio companies, for companies in our coverage universe, but not in our portfolio, right? At any point of time, we want to build the best quality portfolio on the risk reward by reducing the risk to the minimum without compromising much on the returns. That's the objective of this fund. If at any point of time we see, say a TCS becoming far better in our conviction levels versus a Relaxo, there will be a switch, even if there is no deterioration in Relaxo. In another case, if a group finance is being taken over by an HDFC Limited, and hence our expectations of fundamentals have gone through a downgrade overnight, then it makes a lot of sense to make that exit. In a way, coming back to the question that was being asked, which Pramod answered previously, it's a massively disruptive environment out there. Also massively a very evolving environment out there. Nothing lasts forever. Changes will have to be made. As long as we can keep the overall quality of the portfolio high through these partial churns and complete churns, I think it will always add value to the overall fundamental by several percentage points.
So thank you, Rakshit. So thanks, gentlemen, and Saurabh.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Pallav. Thanks for setting this up. Thanks to all of your clients as well for joining today.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks for joining in.
Thank you.
Thanks for Marcellus team for taking the time and joining in.
Thank you for your support, Pallav. You guys, as Pramod said, you guys are auspicious for us. Hopefully, we are auspicious for you guys as well.
Yeah. Always so. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.